The communists were pushed out of the cities. They regrouped after the 1927 crackdown. They fled into the countryside. Mao had led what's called the Autumn Harvest Uprising in Hunan province, where he was from, and was successful for a few months. This showed a possible direction for the Communist Party movement, morphed into more of a peasant uprising, a peasant-based movement. They fled main army. Mao, several conferences, Mao got leadership of the communist movement. Mao is a political genius. He was actually able to break from the Comintern, or break from their advice, their horrible advice that they were giving the Chinese. The more pro-Soviet group was marginalized group called the 28 Bolsheviks. There was a bit of a power struggle. They were pushed out there. They went back to the Soviet Union. Actually, Mao got control of the movement. Led this epic march, a long march through western and northern China. They were being chased and harried by the Kuomintang all along the way. It was epic. They ended up in Yunnan, northern part of Shanxi province, kind of a remote, sort of dry, hard scrabble area. They had an enclave there for quite a while. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang almost defeated the communists. They weren't quite able to do it. There's one incident, the Xi'an incident, where Chiang Kai-shek he moved on Yunnan. His generals kidnapped him basically and forced him to negotiate with the communists. What was going on? The Japanese were encroaching in China. They'd taken Manchuria. They're increasingly encroaching in coastal areas. And Chiang Kai-shek was extremely reluctant to fight them. He wanted to fight the communists. He thought that was the main danger. He was extremely reluctant to fight the Japanese. Meanwhile, Japanese were encroaching, committing atrocity after atrocity, gobbling up China, and people saying, "Look, we got to do something. We got to fight the Japanese." And so there was a real major pushback against Chiang's conciliatory policy with the Japanese, and they forced them. There was some kind of forced alliance with the communists. It was supposedly the communists agreed to be under the command of the Kuomintang army, nominal command anyways. Most of the communists were organized in what's called the Fourth Root Army, and then they did fight against Japanese. Full-scale war broke out. The initial brunt of the fighting was done by the communists. Actually, the Japanese had taken the coastal areas of China. They were encroaching inland. There was bitter fighting in north central plains of China, where the Japanese were extremely brutal, and the communists armed the peasantry. Like if a peasant wanted to fight the Japanese and get a gun, fight the Japanese, the only thing was to be in the Communist Army. So the Communist Party vastly expanded its influence. They were the only people mobilizing the peasants to fight the Japanese. The Kuomintang certainly did not want to mobilize the peasants. Later on, they did fight the Japanese themselves in conventional warfare, and they were not slouches. They did have bitter fights against the Japanese themselves. I'm not saying that, but really the communists mobilized the peasantry. Okay, well, 44, 45 was kind of a standstill. The Japanese encroached as far as they could get in China. They got the coastal areas. They couldn't take all of China. It was just impossible. 1945, the war ended. U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Long story behind that. The Japanese were on the verge of surrender anyway. But, okay, so the war ended. The U.S. came in, and there were some negotiations between the communists and the nationalists for some coalition government. By the way, the American military advisors who would work with the communists, who were liaison with them, really liked them. They were not corrupt. They had the idealism, the elan. Where most people who work with the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek's group, had contempt for them. They were corrupt, brutal, incompetent. The real idealism was with the communists. There was this book by Barbara Tuchman, a liberal historian. Really, the American Joseph Stilwell and the American experience in China. Joe Stilwell, they call him Vinegar Joe. He wouldn't say he was a communist, but he wanted to work with them, thought he should work with these people. He had contempt for Chiang Kai-shek, and there were other people like that as well. During the McCarthy period, these people got a lot of shit, of course, but that didn't happen. The U.S. sent in another negotiating team, this guy Wiedermeyer and Murphy, General Murphy, who were the U.S. was clearly leaning towards one side, was not an honest broker, and the Communists kind of picked that up early, and the negotiations rapidly broke down. Anyway, the U.S. also aided the Kuomintang, the KMT, into reoccupying China. Like the U.S. airlifted the KMT to Manchuria. The Communists had occupied that area. They withdrew, and the U.S. aided them, and they literally airlifted them some places. The U.S. massively aided the KMT to reoccupying China, brought them to Taiwan as well. So, and after 1945, the KMT Kuomintang occupied Taiwan. This is the first time they'd been there during the pre-war era, the pre-war period. The Japanese occupied it, so the KMT occupied Taiwan. Now, the KMT turned out to be really unpopular. They were brutal. They were corrupt, extremely corrupt, incompetent. There was a hyperinflation period. They reacted. The war was over in 1945. And there was some tense standoff. The Communists had their enclave in Yan'an, that big area, like a Soviet enclave, and a few other areas. There was a standoff. The Kuomintang turned to be brutal, corrupt, incompetent. There was a hyperinflation, like 47, 48 or so around that time. They became very unpopular, and then generally there's a mandate of heaven. The popular idea was that the Communists deserve a chance. They find it's their turn now. And the Civil War broke out, really complicated. Originally, it was believed it was from north to south. The Communists controlled the north, pushed the Kuomintang further south. There were three, Battle of Wuhan. There were like three Kuomintang armies actually switched sides. And so anyway, 1949, the Communists took China. Mao had a famous speech, said China may now stand up. And they pushed out a British gunboat, the Panay, I believe. It was cruising the Yangtze River for no reason at all, but they asserted Chinese sovereignty. Okay, what was going on in Taiwan during this time? In, I believe it was 1947, there was an uprising, really big uprising called the 228 Incident. It's little known in the West, but the 228 Incident, February 28th, anniversaries are big in Chinese culture. The Kuomintang KMT had a tax on tobacco, which was intensely unpopular. They had pretty high tobacco tax. And in Taiwan, they were considered very corrupt and brutal. The governor was a guy named Chen Yi, and he was nicknamed the Robber. The Kuomintang, like most of the businesses, were originally controlled by the Japanese. So the KMT took the Japanese businesses, but they were so corrupt about it. There were enormous amount of corruption, cronyism. And KMT became intensely unpopular, really resented. There was an incident where the police beat up this woman in her 40s, a tobacco vendor, like a street vendor selling cigarettes and tobacco. They beat her up, didn't kill her, but beat her up. There was a protest erupted. One protester was killed, and all hell broke loose. Massive uprising all over Taiwan. Mobs of people stormed government offices. Militias formed, local militias formed, and took over county seats and local governments. And there was an uprising called the 228 Incident, and it was crushed. Very brutally crushed. I don't know, estimates are maybe between 4,000 to 30, 40, 50,000 people were killed. We don't really know. The Kuomintang says that the records were lost. It was a horrific time, and this was the beginning of what's known as the White Terror. Seriously, the White Terror really was a period of martial law, which lasted till 1987, 86 or 87, like close to 40 years. It was the longest period of martial law in history. It was an extremely repressive period. Intellectuals were massacred, leftists were massacred, indigenous people, any actors, anybody who was suspected of slight criticism of the Kuomintang regime was killed. Horrible tortures. I will share some links. This was a searing time in Taiwanese history. It was literally, the Kuomintang literally had a war against the people of Taiwan. It's totally accurate to say this, I think. Okay, well, in 1949, the KMT was pushed out of mainland China. They fled to Taiwan. Something like, in the following months or years, something like close to 1.5 million mainlanders fled to Taiwan. And I think the population of Taiwan is something like 30 million. Don't quote me on this, but about 1.5 million people fled to Taiwan. There were two communities. The mainlanders, who were in a privileged position, they were the Waishengren, I believe it's called. The native-born Taiwanese and their descendant were the Banshangren. I believe I may have gotten this wrong, but there were two communities, and the Taiwanese were discriminated against. The people who fled to Taiwan were the KMT, the government bureaucrats, much of the government bureaucracy, the military, Shanghai business elites. All these groups flooded into Taiwan when the communists took over the mainland over the next months and years. Officially, the People's Republic of China was declared, like they controlled the mainland in 1949. They didn't fully consolidate until a couple of years later. Kuomintang army still controlled large areas of western and southern China, Yunnan province, Tibet. They controlled that region. They were pushed out. Kuomintang army was actually pushed into Burma, and they were there for like many decades. They became like a CIA heroin smuggling operation, warlord. And really fascinating, weird history, fascinating history, part of the Golden Triangle in Burma, Myanmar. I don't know the connection of this group with the government of Taiwan. I think there's some connection. Okay, so that's the situation. So the Chiang Kai-shek officially resigned as president, but he later made himself president again. So he had this regime in Taiwan. And the idea, the official policy was that they were going to reinvade the mainland, retake the mainland. Now, initially, both Roosevelt, FDR, and Harry Truman didn't like Chiang Kai-shek. They hated the guy, and some evidence they wouldn't really care if he was wiped out, if the communists defeated him initially. I got that impression. Although when they fled to Taiwan, some U.S., not the 7th Fleet, but some U.S. ships kind of protected him, prevented the communists from crossing over the Taiwan Straits. I'm not entirely sure why they didn't at that time. Anyway, the Korean War changed everything. The U.S. sent the 7th Fleet there to prevent the mainland from invading Taiwan, and they kind of wanted to. There were several, after the Korean War, 50s and 60s, there were several attempts of the Kuomintang government to actually retake the mainland. And aided by the CIA, they tried to start an uprising on the mainland. One was in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, which had been which had been a disaster. So the Kuomintang tried to take advantage of this, infiltrate, tried to build up rebel armies. It failed, totally failed. They tried this effort several different times. It was massively aided by the CIA, although the U.S. did not militarily back them up. It would have been a war between the U.S. and China. The U.S. wasn't ready for it at the time. Okay, there were in later 50s and 60s, there were 3 different waves of U.S. directed investment to Taiwan. Really complicated and hard. It's hard to find a lot of information, but it's fascinating history. It was a private investment directed by the U.S. government. The U.S. encouraged a lot of investment. 3 different waves, and it helped build up the economy of Taiwan. In the 1960s, they were a major producer of electronics. Later, they're a world producer of microchips. There was a U.S. built up, like post-war, but in Cold War era, built up the states like surrounding China and some things surrounding the Soviet Union, built them up. The exact opposite. The U.S. used on these countries, used the exact opposite method of what the U.S. is preaching now, not neoliberalism like IMF, enforced austerity and cutbacks. These countries use the exact opposite method, used import substitution, highly state-directed form of capitalism, import substitution, protectionism. Really interesting. The Kuomintang actually in the 50s carried out a land reform program in Taiwan They never did it. They weren't able to do it in the mainland because the social base with the landlords and the Shanghai bankers were closely connected to them. They couldn't do it on the mainland, but actually they did carry out a land reform in Taiwan because a large part of the land had been owned by the Japanese for one thing, and the Kuomintang did not have ties with the elite of Taiwan. So they didn't care. So they did carry out a land reform, which did aid the economy, developing the economy. Okay, so that's the situation. It was kind of a deadlock for decades after this. And it was very repressive in Taiwan. Peak of the repression was like in the early 50s, Korean War era, but it remained repression. Repression remained to the late 1980s, a really long time. I'll share some articles. Share some articles. Okay, backtrack again. Things changed. China, there's a Sino-Soviet split in 1960. I won't complicate history. I won't go into that. Sino-Soviet split in 1960. Then China later, late 60s, had the mid-late 60s had the Cultural Revolution. And China became very, very isolated. Literally for a time, their only ally was Albania. They became extremely isolated. So towards the end, like very early 70s, the Cultural Revolution was wound down. The Chinese military basically got control. And the leadership, Mao and the leadership, kind of put out some signals that they'd be willing to have a rapprochement with the West or open themselves up. There was also, by the way, losing my voice, there were border clashes with the Soviet Union, like 1969, 70. There's some border clashes. So China was in a really isolated situation. They put out feelers. They wouldn't want to open up to the West, which they later did. Henry Kissinger was a horrible war criminal. He actually responded. He secretly met with Zhou Enlai. Forgot to mention, whole chunk I forgot to mention here. During the period, initial Cold War period, the U.S. had a major embargo on China. No trade was allowed. No trade with China. China was diplomatically and politically isolated. Losing my voice. Taiwan, small country of Taiwan, I think about 30 million people, had their UN seat. And it was kind of an absurd situation. China was over 1 billion people, but their UN seat was held by the Taiwanese government, and no one really very few countries have diplomatically recognized China. They were extremely isolated. The U.S. was the global hegemon and enforced this isolation. Okay, so things did change. There's a Sino-Soviet split. Oh yeah, another thing I forgot to mention, the Bandung Conference, 1956, non-aligned movement. China did play a role. Zhou Enlai did play a role. He was kind of friends with Nehru for a while, although there's a Chinese-Indian split, and there's a brief border war. But Zhou Enlai wanted to make friends with the Indian leadership, had outreach to that. Also, Zhou Enlai helped kickstart the Bandung Non-Aligned Conference in the 50s. In 1956, the CIA shot down his plane. Not making this up. Apparently, a plane in Indonesia, which he was supposed to take, was shot down. He killed 15 people. At the very last moment, for some quirk, he decided to take another plane. That's the only reason he survived. The CIA tried to kill him. He was the second person in the Chinese leadership. Not well-known fact. Okay. So, fast forward by 1971, there was an opening. Henry Kissinger met with Zhou Enlai. The U.S. tried to kill him like 10 years earlier. Met with Zhou Enlai, and then Nixon famously visited China. I think it was 1972. Epic at the time. It was epic. Nixon was the only guy who could do it because he was a sleazy redbaiter who started his career. Basically, he destroyed the career of a congresswoman, Helen Gagan Douglas, I believe her name was, a liberal Democrat, and Nixon had this extremely sleazy red baiting and insinuating she was a communist. Now, I don't support either party, they're bourgeois politicians, but this Helen Douglas was more legitimate than Nixon was a freaking sleazeball. But Nixon got away. So later on, when he was president, he was able to make the opening to China. No one else could do it during the Cold War period. So Nixon visited China, and there was the famous 72, I believe, the famous Shanghai communique, where the U.S. agreed to a one-China policy. There was diplomatic ambiguity, but there was a joint communique. They said the U.S. and China will work towards full diplomatic relations, and both agreed there's one China. It was kind of subtly agreed to disagree which China that was. So again, there are two. There's the Republic of China on Taiwan and the People's Republic of China on the mainland. They both claim to be the government of all of China. They obviously weren't. The Republic of China tried. They had official policy to take back the mainland after a decade or so. Was never going to happen, but that was the official idea. And the U.S. originally really recognized the Republic of China, really pushed it. This was reversed in the early 70s. And the U.S. pivoted to recognizing mainland China, the People's Republic of China. It didn't happen right away, a period of about 7 or 8 years, really, during the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter, I think 1979, the U.S. fully recognized China, the People's Republic of China. They got a seat in the UN. Many other countries followed the lead of the U.S. and pivoted towards the PRC, and they got their seat in the UN. Made a lot more sense. Okay, well, while that was going on, the period of repression, the White Terror continued in Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek, the old bastard, died in 1975. Someone else took over, like vice president, took over for a few years, but his son Chiang Ching-kuo, took over, and he was president of the Republic of China, technically, from 1978 to 1988. He kind of unremarkable. He eased up on the repression. Eased up. Still, the White Terror period continued, but he eased up on the repression. Allowed some organizing, like people tried to there were protest movements beginning, and people tried to organize opposition political parties. They were crushed, but not as brutally as would have happened under his father. Basically, the state of emergency was finally officially ended in 1987 at the very end of Chiang Ching-kuo's presidency. And so it was gradually easing the repression, gradually easing it. The state of emergency was finally ended in 1987, towards the end of Chiang Ching-kuo's presidency. And the person after him was Lee Dong-wei. He was the first Taiwanese-born president. Interesting cat. He was a KMT president, Kuomintang president. Interesting cat. Apparently, he served in the Japanese army during the Second World War. Yeah, he was an officer. And at the end of 1945, the Japanese brought him to Tokyo, actually helping in relief work and cleanup efforts after the bombing of Tokyo. Then, anyway, he went back to Taiwan. He went to university there, and he joined the Communist Party. He was in the Communist Party twice for brief stints. He left it, and he later claimed, he became anti-communist. Communism didn't work. Now, this to me both strikes me as really odd. Now, in fact, he was in the Japanese military. On the mainland, he most likely would have been shot as a traitor, either by the KMT or by the communists. Either group would have shot him as a traitor. He had worked for the enemy. As I said, in Taiwan, they didn't have as much of a negative view of the Japanese. They weren't like as much of the enemy as they were on the mainland. So I guess he could get away with it. I don't really know. And he was also in the Communist Party briefly, twice, which is kind of odd for somebody who was a Kuomintang politician. A case could be made he was some kind of mole or some kind of intrigue. I don't know what was going on. He was an interesting cat. Anyway, he studied agriculture in Taiwan and also studied in the U.S. at Cornell, and became sort of a world-respected agronomist, agricultural expert. He was kind of a technocrat figure. He ran institutes and whatever, government bureaucracy. He joined the Kuomintang, the KMT, in 1971. Like, he was not one of the old-timers from the mainland. He joined later in 1971. And he rose up in the party. He was really opposed by a lot of the hardline faction. The Sung family, lots of others, the hardline faction really hated him. But he became kind of president of Taiwan in 1988, and he became like fully elected in his own right. Not an open election, but like a parliamentary election, 1996 to 2000. and he was president of Taiwan. Interesting guy. He ended the repression. He ended a lot of the finally. There was what they call. It didn't mention the system in Taiwan for decades. They had a legislature. Okay, they didn't have any much power. It was basically a military dictatorship, but they had a legislature, and the majority of the people in the legislature, Taiwanese legislature, were from the mainland. They literally were very elderly men who hadn't been to their provinces they were supposed to represent for decades, and they were the majority of the people in the legislature. It's basically an absurd situation. They call them the 10,000, jokingly called the 10,000 year legislators. They weren't accountable anyway. They were just from the mainland for decades, and so Lee Teng-hui finally ended that system, modernized the country, opened up the system. There were, like under Chiang Kai-shek's son, there were attempts to organize. They were crushed, but Lee Teng-hui opened it up, and there was opposition parties were allowed. There was a union movement. The labor unions were originally KMT labor unions, essentially company unions. They were made more independent unions. There was some labor unrest, a wave of strikes. Independent union movement developed. And also political opposition group called the Democratic People's Party, called the DPP, the Democratic People's Party, formed. They formed out of several student movements and intellectual movements, protest movements, which occurred like 80s and 90s and so on. They originally consisted of opponents of the Kuomintang, victims of the repression, farmers groups, environmental groups. They could be seen, I guess, as a social democratic party in opposition to the Kuomintang. There's some odd political ironies which started developing. The DPP, part of the PAN, they call themselves part of the Pan-Green Coalition, allied with several smaller parties. They're kind of many of them, not all the members, but at their heart, they're a Taiwanese independence party. Not everyone says this, not all the members agree with this, but the core, there are factions, they're Taiwanese independence. So the KMT was against declaring independence. Okay, that's kind of the background. So Lee Teng-hui was an interesting guy. He ran it, and he was president of Taiwan, I believe, till 2000. Interestingly, he himself, after he stepped down as president, he himself advocated Taiwanese independence. He was expelled from the KMT. He kind of interesting character. I don't really know what was going on with him, but he became closer to the opposition, to the DPP group, and the Kuomintang finally expelled him at that point. Okay, so the next president after Lee Teng-hui from I think 2000-2008 was named Chen Shui-bian. He was from the DPP party. Finally, the Kuomintang allowed an election. It was the first popular open election in 2000. And in recent decades, there's been a major, Taiwanese society is coming to terms with the horrific period of repression they went through. As far as I know, no one's been prosecuted. I don't think anybody ever will be. But it's openly discussed. There are memorials and activist groups, protest groups in favor of supporting the people who have been repressed, and people who are openly talking about it. There's research on it and things like that. So there's some coming to terms with it. Not completely, but some coming to terms with it. And the political configuration also changed. The KMT, the Kuomintang, the original party that was going to invade the mainland, now is closer to the mainland. They want closer ties with the mainland, while the DPP, the party, Social Democratic Party, which evolved in opposition to the Kuomintang, they're kind of sort of separatists. Now, there is not a major independence movement in Taiwan. The majority of people, in Taiwan, ethnic Chinese or minorities or other groups, the indigenous people, they want to keep the status quo. Most people don't want to declare independence. Maybe one poll said maybe 20% of the people do, but most of the people just want to keep things just the way they are. They probably don't want to be part of the People's Republic of China, to be blunt, but they don't want to be independent either. They are Chinese. It's kind of China's constitution, the People's Republic of China's constitution. They do have it to the part of the constitution is that the goal is to reunite with Taiwan. and they said they want to do it by peaceful means, but if not, they'll do it. They'll do it militarily. It's in the Chinese Constitution. This is reuniting Taiwan is a deeply felt thing within China. And many opinion polls on the mainland say, they definitely want to reunite with Taiwan. The Chinese kind of see it. Was sort of in the Second World War. Japan was a Japanese aircraft carrier. Essentially, it was a base for the Japanese occupation of the mainland. The Japanese used it as a base, and they're kind of worried the U.S. is kind of doing this again. Now, U.S. officially, by the late 70s, officially recognized People's Republic of China. It's based on 3 communiques, which the Chinese call like the guardrails of Chinese-American relations. But the U.S. has been nibbling away at this starting under the Carter administration, like we were fully recognizing China, but it was a way to saying to Taiwan, like, okay, we still got your back. Don't worry, we still got your back. This massively aid to Taiwan, massively, big time, accelerated under the Clinton administration. I'm not entirely sure why, probably because the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the U.S. saying to China, like, we don't need you anymore. There was a tacit alliance in the late 80s between the U.S. and China. The U.S. shared military intelligence with China, like about Soviet troop movements on the border, things like that. The U.S. was sharing military knowledge with the Chinese. Interestingly, during the Reagan administration, used some Maoist rhetoric, like the Contra War in Nicaragua. The U.S. was, according to the Reagan administration, was fighting Soviet social hegemony in Central America using kind of weird Maoist rhetoric. Mao, forgot to mention, had this like later life, and with 3 worlds theory, that yes, the U.S. is imperialist, so is the Soviet Union. Soviet social hegemony, and maybe the idea that the Soviet imperialism is actually worse. It was kind of like the Shachtmanites in the U.S. U.S. is imperialist, but Soviet Union is worse. It kind of was an opportunist take, and after Mao died, China took a right-wing foreign policy. They supported Pinochet, actually, and they supported the apartheid regime in South Africa. They supported the U.S. in Afghanistan. It was kind of odd premonition. Okay, so back to Taiwan. U.S., especially under the Clinton administration, there were huge provocations. U.S. sold a huge amount of military equipment to Taiwan. By the way, this is the Taiwan Relations Act is constantly being updated. I think it came late 70s. I think it was started in 1979, just to counterbalance U.S. recognizing mainland China. There's a Taiwan Relations Act, which U.S. reserved the right to sell from weaponry and support the Taiwanese government. So this accelerated under Clinton. There were massive weapon sales to Taiwan. One point, Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House, visited Taiwan, major provocation. He was a different party from Clinton, and for a variety of reasons, it wasn't as extreme provocation as Pelosi's visit to Taiwan now. And at one point, the U.S. actually sent an aircraft carrier across the Taiwan Strait when Gingrich was visiting Taiwan. Huge provocations. This was considered, Chinese internal territory. Huge provocation. And also in 1999, U.S. bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. NATO-U.S. bombing of Serbia. The Chinese embassy was bombed. U.S. claimed it was an accident. The Chinese didn't really believe it. There were mass protests all over China because of this. So major provocations during the Clinton administration, and this accelerated on and off. Obama as well, and Reagan big time. And the U.S. has been kind of, officially recognized the one China policy, but nibbling away at it as much as possible. Now, there's growing trade. Taiwan was becoming a normal bourgeois democracy. There was some trade in the 90s. By the way, when the first DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, was elected, there was some tension. Previous Lee Dong-wei visited Cornell. This is during the Clinton administration. He went to Cornell. He was there as a student years earlier, but he came to Cornell, visited, gave a commencement address or something, as the president of China. And People's Republic of China saw this as a provocation, huge provocation. They fired missiles into the Taiwan Strait. There's the third Taiwan crisis. The Chinese were pretty upset about that. There was trade with Taiwan. China, mainland Taiwan trade started, like, I think in the early 90s. It was small in the early 90s. Then it accelerated. I think throughout the 90s there was trade, but it was technically illegal. It was trade by way of Hong Kong or indirect trade, but it's finally normalized, legalized, and there's enormous trade right now. Something like 40% of Taiwan's trade is with the mainland. There's, I believe, now $188 billion worth of Taiwanese investment on the mainland. So the two entities have trade ties, investment ties. A lot of tourism too. People from the mainland, they can visit back and forth. People from the mainland go to Taiwan. People from Taiwan can visit the mainland. I've been to China. I've traveled in China. I've met many people from Taiwan. Mostly business people traveling, and people reunite. You can visit back and forth. And trade now is booming. The famous Foxconn, they were back in the like 2010, 2008 or so. Stories about workers in Shenzhen. Foxconn, they make cell phone components or whatever. They had put suicide nets up, so working conditions were so horrible. It was actually a Taiwanese company. After that incident, Foxconn actually closed down their factory. They relocated to more interior China, and they were entirely automated. So yeah, there's huge Taiwanese investment on the mainland, everywhere. So it goes. So the DPP party, so social democratic, the environmentalist groups. There's somewhat an LGBT movement in Taiwan. The DPP is most likely closely embedded with the CIA, closely embedded with the CIA. I'm certain they have a large role in this. They're pushing them in one direction. U.S. is pushing them in a certain direction in anti-Chinese. There are different ways this could play out. Taiwan is part of China. I do have criticisms of the People's Republic of China, but this is Pelosi is visiting Taiwan. Weird, unnecessary provocation. A little while after she was elected a congressperson, she came to China in 1991. It was like 2 years after Tiananmen Square. She unfurled the banner. She went to Tiananmen Square with a couple other politicians, unfurled the banner. This was and she was detained and kicked out of China. This was a publicity stunt. There was a large Chinese community in San Francisco where she's from, and they were fairly, at the time, pro-KMT, pro-Guomindang, and so she was appealing for their votes. Pelosi was supposedly a progressive, but she opposed the war in Iraq, but she supported a lot of other stuff. She's a horrible person. She denies us health care. Her and her husband are massive insider trading. There's the famous, around election 2000, she likes gourmet ice cream. Okay, who doesn't like ice cream? But she has a $20,000 refrigerator to keep her ice cream, and she was this weird ad, like campaign ad around 2020, where at the same time during the COVID lockdowns, the California economy collapsed. There was a scene where there's a massive line of cars to get like food handouts, food distribution. So the Republicans made a lot out of that. Pelosi came off like a totally out of touch Marie Antoinette type figure. So she's apparently going to Taiwan. As I'm saying this, I believe her plane is in Honolulu, Hawaii for a layover. It's very unclear how this is going to play out. Garland Nixon had a worst case scenario how a military confrontation would play out. If there is a the Chinese are threatening this. If there is a direct military confrontation, China would win. Basically, they could take out U.S. carrier groups, maybe 30 to 50,000 people would be killed. U.S. would not be able to sustain a war. U.S. would not be with China's supply line, like a 7,000-mile long supply line. It's just not in China's industrial superpower now. It's not like it was like 30, 40, 50 years ago. So my guess would be a sitzkrieg, like a standoff war. Before all this happens, there are things short of war China could do. They could sell off their dollars. They could have an economic embargo of the U.S. It would be a disaster for China, but it would be a worse catastrophe for the U.S. The U.S. economy would go to a standstill. So China owns a lot of U.S. dollars, by the way. It's a big part of this thing. So really complicated. I don't know how this would play out. just the U.S. media is taking like a lively democracy in Taiwan is being imperiled by the Chinese communists. We have to help them. That kind of nonsense. So I hope this made sense. My video was a little disjointed, but I'll make more videos. Hope you enjoyed, and thank you very much for listening. Please, if you like my content, please subscribe. Thank you very much.